The lightning split the black sky like God's own fury, illuminating for one terrible instant the woman crawling through mud and sagebrush, her swollen belly contracting with pain that made her scream into the howling wind. Celeste Monroe was dying in the worst storm the Arizona Territory had seen in 50 years, her child fighting to be born in a tempest that could kill them both. When out of the chaos came a figure that shouldn't exist, an Apache warrior who would defy everything the white world believed about his people to save two lives that weren't his to save. The storm had been building for 3 days when Celeste first felt the pains. She'd been traveling with the Hartwell wagon train, 27 families heading west toward California gold country, when the weather turned violent in ways that made even the seasoned trail guides nervous. The sky took on a greenish cast that spoke of tornadoes, and the wind began to howl with a voice that seemed to come from hell itself. Old Benjamin Hartwell, who'd led 4 trains across the territories without losing a single soul, kept looking up at those clouds with the expression of a man who'd just seen his own grave. Celeste Celia Monroe wasn't supposed to be on this journey at all. 6 months pregnant and recently widowed, she'd left everything behind in St. Louis after her husband Thomas died in a factory accident, crushed beneath machinery that should have been repaired months earlier. The Kellerman Steelworks had been cutting corners for years. Everyone knew it. But nobody talked about it because jobs were scarce and mouths needed feeding. When the main press finally gave way during the morning shift, it took 3 good men with it, including Thomas, who'd been trying to fix a belt that had been fraying for weeks. The company offered her $40 and a handshake, as if that could replace the man who'd promised her a new life in the West. $40 for a husband who'd worked 16-hour days in heat that could melt iron, who'd saved every penny for 2 years to buy passage on a wagon train, who'd whispered dreams of orange groves and Pacific sunsets into her ear every night as they lay in their cramped tenement room listening to rats scratch in the walls. But Thomas had already sold everything they owned, already bought passage with the Hartwell train, already filled her head with dreams that seemed too precious to abandon just because he was gone. The other families on the train treated her with the careful politeness reserved for disasters waiting to happen. A pregnant widow was bad luck, they whispered, when they thought she couldn't hear, a burden who'd slow them down when speed meant the difference between reaching California before winter or dying in the Sierra Nevada passes. Mrs. Abigail Hartwell, the wagon master's wife, had been particularly vocal about her concerns. A thin, sharp-faced woman who wore righteousness like armor, she'd made several pointed comments about women in delicate conditions who had no business attempting such dangerous journeys. She'd suggested that Celeste might be more comfortable staying in Kansas City, perhaps finding work as a seamstress or taking in laundry, anything more suitable for a woman in her circumstances. But Celeste had survived worse than their disapproval. She'd grown up the daughter of Irish immigrants in 5 Points, the most dangerous neighborhood in New York City, where children learned to fight before they learned to read, and survival meant never showing weakness to anyone, ever. Her father, Seamus Monroe, had worked the docks when there was work and drank when there wasn't, which was most of the time. Her mother, Bridget, had taken in washing and mending, her hands permanently stained with lye, and her back bent from years of scrubbing other people's clothes. The Monroe family had lived in a single room with 6 other people, sleeping in shifts and eating whatever scraps could be found or stolen. Celeste learned to stretch a dollar until it screamed, how to mend clothes with thread made from unraveled rope, how to make soup from bones other people threw away, how to smile and say, "Yes, ma'am," to wealthy ladies who treated her like she was something stuck to their shoe. She'd clawed her way out of 5 Points through sheer determination and a willingness to work jobs that would break most people. Meeting Thomas had been the first piece of real luck in her life. He was different from the boys in her neighborhood, gentle where they were rough, hopeful where they were bitter. He talked about the West like it was heaven itself, a place where a man could own land and build something that belonged to him, where the sky stretched forever and there was room enough for anyone willing to work for it. When he proposed, she said yes, not just because she loved him, but because he represented escape from a life that would grind her into dust. Now here she was, carrying his child toward the dream they'd shared, and the sky was trying to kill her for it. What she didn't know was how to birth a baby, alone in the wilderness, with a storm trying to tear the world apart, and no one to help her but strangers who saw her as a liability. The first real contraction hit her while she was gathering buffalo chips for the evening fire. The wagon train had stopped early, spooked by the strange color of the sky and the way the horses kept prancing sideways, ears laid back against some danger they could sense but not see. The oxen were lowing nervously, and the milk cows had gone, dry with stress. Even the camp dog seemed uneasy, whining and pacing instead of begging for scraps as usual. Celeste had volunteered for fuel duty, partly to be useful and partly to get away from Mrs. Hartwell's increasingly pointed comments about women in delicate conditions who should know their limitations. The other women were huddled in their wagons, mending or cooking or tending. Children, but she'd never been good at sitting still when there was work to be done. Besides, gathering buffalo chips gave her a chance to be alone with her thoughts and the life growing inside her. The pain started as a tightness across her lower back, like someone drawing a rope around her waist and slowly pulling it tight. She'd felt it before over the past weeks, false alarms that came and went like storm clouds on a summer day. The midwife back in St. Louis had warned her about this, told her that first babies often took their time and sent plenty of warnings before they decided to make their appearance. But this was different. This grabbed her belly with iron fingers and squeezed until she dropped to her knees in the sagebrush, gasping for breath she couldn't find. The contraction lasted nearly a full minute, an eternity of pain that left her shaking and nauseated. When it finally released her, she found herself on her hands and knees in the dirt, surrounded by scattered buffalo chips and the growing certainty that this was no false alarm. The baby was coming, ready or not, and she was still 3 weeks away from Fort Bridger, where they'd planned to rest and resupply. When she looked up, the sky had turned the color of an old bruise, purple-black clouds boiling like soup in a witch's cauldron. The wind carried a smell she'd never encountered before, something wild and electric that made her skin crawl and her hair stand on end. In the distance, she could hear the other women calling children inside wagons, their voices tight with the kind of fear that comes from knowing you're about to face something you can't control. She managed to gather what buffalo chips she could carry and make it back to her wagon just as the first drops began to fall. Not rain exactly, but something harder and colder, pellets of ice that stung like angry wasps and bounced off the ground with sharp cracking sounds. The canvas cover of her wagon snapped and cracked in the wind like gunshots, and the whole vehicle rocked on its wheels as if some invisible giant was trying to shake it apart. Inside her wagon, surrounded by the few possessions she had left in the world, Celeste tried to prepare for what was coming. She had clean cloth for the baby, a sharp knife that Thomas had given her for protection, and a bottle of whiskey that was supposed to be for celebrating their arrival in California. She'd watched other women give birth in the tenements, heard the screams and seen the blood, but she'd never paid close attention to the actual process. It was women's business, something you learned when your time came. The second contraction came 20 minutes later, stronger than the first, lasting so long she thought it might never end. She bit her lip until she tasted blood, trying not to cry out and frighten the children in the next wagon. The Carlson family had 3 little ones, and they were already terrified by the storm. But when the pain finally released her, she knew. with terrible certainty that this baby was coming tonight, ready or not, storm or no storm. By full dark, the Tempest had become something beyond weather, something that seemed almost alive in its fury. The wind screamed like a banshee, tearing at anything not nailed down, and the rain came in sheets so thick you couldn't see your own hand stretched out in front of you. Lightning cracked overhead with the sound of the world breaking in half, illuminating the landscape in stark, terrifying detail before plunging everything back into darkness. Thunder rolled across the desert like the footsteps of angry gods, making the ground shake and the wagon wheels creak ominously. The temperature had dropped 20 degrees in as many minutes, and the rain was turning to sleet that drummed against the canvas cover with a sound like bullets. Celeste huddled under every blanket she owned, but the cold seemed to seep through, everything settling into her bones and making her teeth chatter. The contractions were coming faster now, every 15 minutes or so, each one stronger than the last. That's when disaster struck. A particularly violent gust of wind caught her wagon at just the wrong angle, and she heard the terrible sound of splintering wood. The wagon tongue, the wooden beam that connected her oxen to the wagon, snapped clean in two like a matchstick. Without that crucial connection, her entire home began rolling backward down the slight slope they'd camped on, with her inside it screaming as another contraction tore through her body like a knife. She felt the wagon tip as it hit a boulder, heard the terrible grinding sound of wood against rock, and then she was flying through darkness and pain and the taste of her own blood. The canvas cover tore away in the wind, taking most of her possessions with it. Clothes, blankets, food, the precious few photographs of Thomas, everything scattered across the desert like seeds in a hurricane. The last thing she saw before hitting the ground was lightning, illuminating the wreckage of her life, her hopes and dreams reduced to splinters and soggy cloth. The impact drove the breath from her lungs and sent new waves of agony through her already tortured body. She lay in the mud and sagebrush for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, gasping and bleeding and waiting for the next contraction to hit. When it did, it was so powerful, it made her vision go white around the edges, and she realized with horror that the baby was coming much faster than she'd expected. When she finally managed to lift her head and look around, the wagon train was gone. Not just invisible in the storm, but actually gone, the sound of their wheels and voices swallowed by distance and thunder. They'd probably never even noticed her wagon rolling away in the chaos, or if they had, they'd assumed she was already dead. In weather like this, stopping to search could mean losing more lives, and she was just one woman, already more burden than help. The cold mathematics of survival didn't include heroic rescues for pregnant widows who should have stayed. Home. Panic set in then, cold and sharp as the sleet that pelted her exposed skin. She was alone in the wilderness, miles from any settlement, with a baby trying to be born in the worst storm anyone could remember. The landscape in daylight had been endless sagebrush and red rock, beautiful in its harsh way but offering no shelter from tempests like this. Now in the darkness and rain, it became a maze of shadows and threats, every bush a potential enemy, every rock a place to break bones she couldn't afford to break. She tried to stand and immediately fell again as another contraction hit, this one so powerful it left her retching in the mud. The baby felt impossibly low now, pressing down with a weight that made her legs shake and her back scream in protest. She needed help, needed shelter, needed someone who knew what they were doing when babies decided to come early, in the middle of nowhere. But there was no one, just her and the storm, and a child who wouldn't wait for better circumstances. Crawling seemed like her only option, though she had no idea where to crawl to. The pain made it hard to think clearly, and the darkness made it impossible to see more than a few feet in any direction. Every time lightning flashed, she caught glimpses of a landscape that looked like the surface of the moon, desolate, alien, utterly inhospitable to human life. But she had to try something because lying in the open meant death for both her and the baby. She crawled for what felt like hours, stopping every few minutes when the contractions seized her, leaving her, gasping and shaking in the increasingly thick mud. Her hands were bleeding from the rocks and thorns, her knees were raw, and her dress was torn to ribbons. The baby felt impossibly large now, stretching her from the inside and demanding to be born whether she was ready or not. The pain was becoming constant, no longer coming in waves, but building to one continuous agony that made thinking nearly impossible. That's when she saw the light. Just a flicker at first, visible only during lightning flashes, but definitely there when everything else was darkness and chaos. A warm yellow glow that spoke of fire and shelter and possibly other human beings who might help her. It seemed impossibly far away, but it was the only hope she had. She changed direction, crawling toward it with desperate determination, even though every movement sent new waves of pain through her tortured body. The journey to that light became an epic of survival, each yard gained through sheer will and the refusal to die in the mud like an animal. She lost track of time, of everything except the need to keep moving toward that beacon of hope. Her world narrowed to the space immediately in front of her hands, to the rhythm of crawling and pausing and crawling again, to the growing certainty that her child was going to be born very soon, whether she reached shelter or not. The light came from a shallow cave, really just a deep overhang in the red rock that provided some protection from the worst of the storm. And sitting calmly in front of a small, well-banked fire, as if deadly tempests were just another part of his evening routine, was a man unlike any she'd ever seen. He was Apache, that much was clear from his long black hair and the way he wore buckskin and beadwork that caught the firelight. But everything else about him defied her expectations of what an Apache warrior should be. He wasn't painted for war, wasn't whooping or brandishing weapons, wasn't doing any of the savage things the penny dreadfuls back in St. Louis claimed. All Indians did. Instead, he was simply sitting by his fire, working on what looked like a piece of leather, with the calm concentration of a man who had all the time in the world. His movements were precise and economical, and there was something almost meditative about the way he worked, as if he'd found perfect peace in this small sanctuary while chaos raged outside. When he looked up and saw her crawling toward his shelter, bloody and mud-soaked and obviously in labor, his expression didn't change at all. No surprise, no fear, no anger at having his solitude interrupted by a white woman in distress. He simply set aside his work, stood up with fluid grace that spoke of years of living close to the earth, and walked out into the storm to meet her, as if this were the most natural thing in the world. She tried to speak, to explain who she was and what had happened, but another contraction hit her just as he reached down to lift her from the mud. The pain was so intense she could only scream, clutching at his buckskin shirt while her body tried to tear itself in half. She expected him to drop her, to step back in alarm or disgust at the sight of a white woman in such distress, but his arms remained steady and strong, carrying her toward the warm glow of his fire as if she weighed nothing at all. He laid her down on soft furs inside the cave, his movements gentle despite his obvious strength. The relief of being out of the wind and rain was so intense it brought tears to her eyes, and for a moment she could almost forget the pain that was building toward another peak. The cave was larger than it had appeared from outside, extending back into the rock far enough to provide real shelter. The fire was perfectly positioned to throw heat without filling the space with smoke, and she could see various supplies arranged neatly along the walls. Up close, she could see he was younger than she'd first thought. Probably no more than 30, with intelligent dark eyes and hands that moved with the confidence of someone who'd dealt with emergencies before. His face was lean and weathered, with the kind of calm strength that comes from living in harsh country and surviving by wit and skill rather than luck. When he spoke, his English was clear and unaccented, educated in a way that surprised her. "Your baby comes tonight," he said, stating it as simple fact rather than question or concern. "The storm will not wait, and neither will this child. We must work together if both of you are to survive this night." She wanted to ask who he was, why he was helping her, why he wasn't afraid of the storm or of helping a white woman who might bring trouble down on him later. The Apache was supposed to be hostile to whites, everyone knew that, and a warrior helping a pregnant woman would be seen as weakness by some and betrayal by others. But another contraction was building, stronger than all the others combined, and she could feel the baby moving lower, demanding to be born, whether she was ready or not. "I don't know what to do," she gasped, the admission torn from her lips by fear and pain that made everything else seem unimportant. "I've never done this before. My husband died before he could be here. I was supposed to have a midwife in California. I wasn't supposed to be alone like this." "My name is Mahpe," he said, cutting through her panic with quiet authority that somehow made her believe everything might be all right. "It means sky in my language, and you are not alone anymore. I have helped bring children into the world before, both Apache and white. Your baby will be born safely. But you must trust me and do exactly as I say. Can you do that?" The fire crackled and hissed as raindrops found their way past the rocky overhang, and somewhere in the distance, thunder rolled like the drums of war. But inside this small sanctuary, with an Apache warrior whose name meant sky watching over her, Celeste Monroe began to believe that maybe, just maybe, she and her child might actually survive this terrible night. Another contraction hit, stronger than all the others combined, lasting so long she thought she might die from the pain alone. But this time, when it reached its peak, and she screamed until her throat was raw, she felt something else too. A sense of presence, of someone strong and capable standing guard between her and all the dangers howling outside in the darkness. Someone who had chosen to help her for reasons she didn't understand, but was grateful for beyond words. "Now," Mahpe said, moving with swift efficiency to tend the fire and gather what looked like supplies from deeper in the cave. "Now we begin. The real work. Your child is ready to meet the storm, and we must make sure the storm does not win this battle. Tell me your name, so I know what to call you when the pain becomes too great for politeness." "Celeste," she whispered through gritted teeth, as another wave of pain crested and broke over her like a physical force. "Celeste Monroe, and I think this baby is coming much faster than either of us expected." The contraction left her gasping, clinging to the soft furs beneath her, as if they were the only solid things in a world gone mad. Outside, the storm continued its assault on the desert, but here in Mahpe's sanctuary, time seemed to move differently, measured not in minutes, but in the spaces between her body's demands. Mahpe moved with the fluid efficiency of someone who had delivered children in far worse circumstances than this. From deeper in the cave, he produced a leather pouch that contained items she couldn't identify in the firelight, but his confidence as he arranged them told her everything she needed to know. He had done this before, successfully, and that knowledge became her anchor in the chaos. "In my tribe, we believe that children choose their moment to be born," he said, his voice calm and measured despite the urgency of the situation. "Your child has chosen this storm, this night, this place, perhaps because it knew you would need help, and I would be here to give it." His words carried a weight of belief that transcended the immediate crisis, suggesting a worldview where nothing happened by accident, where even disasters could serve greater purposes. Another contraction began building, and this time Mahpe knelt beside her, placing one steady hand on her shoulder. "Breathe with me," he instructed, his own breathing deep and regular. In through your nose, out through your mouth. Do not fight the pain. Let it flow through you like water through a canyon. Fighting it will only make it stronger. She tried to follow his guidance, though every instinct screamed at her to tense against the agony that was reshaping her body from the inside out. As the contraction peaked and began to ebb, Mahpe started what could only be described as a song, though it was unlike any music she'd ever heard. The words were in Apache, flowing and rhythmic, rising and falling with the natural cadence of wind through stone. It wasn't loud enough to compete with the storm outside, but somehow it seemed to create a pocket of peace within the chaos, a sonic sanctuary that matched the physical one he'd provided. "What are you singing?" she asked when she could speak again, genuinely curious despite her circumstances. The melody seemed to ease something deep inside her, not just the physical pain, but the fear that had been eating at her since the wagon rolled away. There was something ancient and powerful in those words, something that spoke to parts of her she didn't know existed. "It is a song for mothers and children," he replied, checking the fire and adding another piece of carefully selected wood. "My grandmother taught it to me when I was very young. She said it would help me understand what women go through to bring life into the world, so I would never take that sacrifice for granted." The admission revealed layers of character she hadn't expected, suggesting a man raised to honor and respect the feminine strength that made survival possible. The next contraction came sooner than the previous one, and stronger. Celeste found herself gripping Mahpe's hand without conscious thought, surprised by how solid and reassuring his presence felt. His skin was warm and calloused from years of outdoor work, but his touch was gentle, offering support without trying to take control of a process that belonged entirely to her. "Tell me about your husband," he said, as the pain receded, clearly, trying to keep her focused on something other than her fear. "What kind of man was he, that you would make this journey carrying his child?" The question caught her off guard, partly because it came from an Apache warrior she'd known for less than an hour, and partly because talking about Thomas in the present circumstances felt both impossible and necessary. "Thomas was a dreamer," she said finally, surprised by how much she wanted to share this with someone who might understand. "He worked in a steel factory in St. Louis, dangerous work that paid barely enough to keep us fed, but every night he would talk about California. Orange groves and ocean breezes, land a man could own and pass down to his children. He saved every penny for 2 years to buy our passage west." The words came easier than she'd expected, as if the extreme circumstances had stripped away the normal barriers between strangers. "And now you carry both his child and his dream," Mahpe observed, adjusting the furs beneath her to provide better support. "That is a heavy burden for one woman to bear, especially alone." His understanding was deeper than she'd anticipated, suggesting someone who knew what it meant to carry the hopes of others, to be responsible for dreams bigger than oneself. Another contraction hit, this one lasting nearly 2 minutes and leaving her shaking with exhaustion. The baby felt impossibly low now, and she could sense that the actual birth was approaching fast, whether she felt ready or not. Mahpe seemed to recognize this too, because he began making more serious preparations, heating water in a metal pot. She hadn't noticed before, and laying out what looked like clean cloths. "Where did you learn to do this?" she asked, needing to focus on something other than the growing pressure and the certainty that her life was about to change forever. "I mean, helping women give birth. Did you train as a medicine man or something like that?" The question revealed her own ignorance about Apache culture, but Mahpe didn't seem offended by her assumptions. "My sister," he said simply, his voice carrying a weight of memory that spoke of both joy and sorrow. "I helped deliver her 3 children when the tribal midwife was not available, and later, when soldiers came to our village, I helped other women when their time came during the hiding, when we could not call out or make noise that might give away our location. The casual mention of soldiers and hiding revealed a history of violence and displacement that put her own troubles into perspective. "What happened to them?" she asked softly, though part of her was afraid to hear the answer. "Your sister and her children." The question seemed to hang in the air between them, competing with the sound of rain and wind outside. Mape continued his preparations without answering immediately, and she began to think he wouldn't respond at all. "They are safe," he said finally, though something in his tone suggested the path to that safety had been neither easy nor without cost. "Living on the reservation at San Carlos, where they have enough food and the children can learn to read and write in English, it is not the life we were born to, but it is life, and that is something." His acceptance of harsh realities spoke to a maturity forged by circumstances no one should have to endure. The conversation was interrupted by the strongest contraction yet, one that seemed to grab her entire body and squeeze until she thought her bones might break. This time, Mape's hand found hers without being asked, and she held on as if he were the only thing keeping her from drowning in an ocean of pain. His fingers were strong and steady, an anchor in the storm that was reshaping everything she thought she knew about her own limits. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. "You are doing well," he said, as the contraction finally released her. "Better than many women I've helped. Your child is strong, like its mother." The compliment felt earned rather than automatic, and she found herself believing him. She was doing well, against all odds and expectations. She was surviving, something that should have killed her, and maybe that meant she was stronger than she'd ever imagined. As the pain ebbed, she became aware of details she'd missed before. The cave was decorated with symbols painted in what looked like ochre and charcoal, designs that seemed to tell stories or mark important events. Mape's supplies were more extensive than she'd first realized, including not just the basics of survival, but items that suggested someone who lived comfortably in the wilderness, who had made peace with a life lived close to the earth. "Why are you here?" she asked, the question that had been building since she first saw him. "I mean, why are you alone in this cave during the worst storm anyone can remember? Shouldn't you be with your people, your family?" It seemed presumptuous to ask such personal questions, but the intimacy of their situation had made normal social boundaries irrelevant. Mape was quiet for a long moment, tending the fire and checking his preparations. When he finally spoke, his words came slowly, as if he were choosing each one with care. "Sometimes a man needs to be alone with the sky and the stones to remember who he is when no one is watching. I come here when the reservation becomes too small, when I need to remember what it felt like to be free." The admission revealed a depth of longing that resonated with her own desires for something beyond the limitations others tried to impose. "And tonight," she pressed gently, "what brought you here tonight just when I needed you?" The question seemed to surprise him, as if he hadn't fully considered the timing until she pointed it out. He looked at her with those intelligent dark eyes, and she could see him weighing how much to reveal to a white woman he barely knew. "I had a dream 3 nights ago," he said finally, his voice taking on the cadence of someone sharing something sacred. "A woman with hair the color of autumn leaves, crying out in a storm, needing help I could provide. In the dream, there were 2 spirits instead of 1 when morning came, and both were safe." The revelation sent a chill down her spine that had nothing to do with the cold wind finding its way into the cave. Before she could respond to this extraordinary confession, another contraction seized her, stronger and longer than any before. This time, she felt something different, a sense of pressure and movement that told her the baby was really coming now, not in hours, but in minutes. Mape must have seen something in her face because he moved quickly, positioning himself where he could help while still giving her the dignity she deserved. "The head is coming," he said, his voice calm but focused. "Do not push yet. Just breathe and let your body do its work. Pushing too early can cause tearing that will heal badly." His medical knowledge seemed far more extensive than she would have expected, and she found herself trusting his guidance completely. The pain was beyond anything she'd imagined possible, but his presence made it bearable. The storm outside seemed to intensify, as if responding to the drama unfolding in the cave, thunder rolling overhead with such force that she could feel it in her chest. Lightning illuminated the entrance in stroboscopic flashes, creating a wild light show that seemed almost supernatural. But inside their sanctuary, time moved to the rhythm of her breathing and the ancient process of birth. "Now," Mape said, his hands steady and sure, "now you can push with the next contraction. Your baby is ready to meet the world." The moment felt suspended in time, poised between one reality and another. In the space of the next few minutes, she would become a mother. Her child would take its first breath, and both of their lives would be forever changed. The final contraction built like a wave gathering strength in the deep ocean. And she pushed with every ounce of strength she had left, feeling her child move through her and into the world. The sensation was indescribable, part agony and part ecstasy, the most intensely physical experience of her life. And then, suddenly, the pressure was gone, replaced by a feeling of empty lightness that left her gasping. For a terrifying moment, there was silence, except for the storm, and she feared the worst. But then she heard it, faint but unmistakable. The sound of a baby crying, not the lusty wail of a healthy newborn, but the thin, reedy cry of a child who had fought hard to be born. Mape moved quickly, clearing the baby's airway and wrapping the tiny form in soft cloth he'd warmed by the fire. "A son," he said, placing the baby on her chest with infinite gentleness. "Small but strong, like his mother. He will live to see many summers." The certainty in his voice made her believe it, even though the baby seemed impossibly tiny and fragile against her chest. She could feel his heart beating fast and light, like a bird's wing, and the reality of motherhood hit her with overwhelming force. Looking down at her son's face, wrinkled and red but perfect in every way, Celeste felt something shift inside her that went beyond physical recovery. This was Thomas's child, but he was also entirely hers now, her responsibility and her purpose in ways she was only beginning to understand. The storm still raged outside. They were still alone in the wilderness, but somehow everything had changed. "What will you name him?" Mape asked, cleaning up with the same quiet efficiency he'd shown throughout the birth. The question seemed both immediate and impossibly weighty, the first real decision she'd have to make as a mother. She looked at her son, then at the man who had made his safe arrival possible. "Storm," she said without hesitation, the name coming to her as if it had been waiting all along. "His name is Storm Munro, because he chose to be born in the wildest weather the territory has ever seen, and because he was strong enough to survive it." The name felt right in a way that went beyond logic, honoring both the circumstances of his birth and the strength he'd already shown. Mape smiled for the first time since she'd met him, and the expression transformed his entire face, revealing the warmth that had been hidden beneath his calm competence. "Storm," he repeated, as if testing how the name felt in his mouth. "Yes, that is a good name for one born on such a night. The spirits will remember him." His approval felt like a benediction, marking the end of one chapter of her life and the beginning of another. Outside, the tempest continued to rage with undiminished fury, but inside the cave, 3 people who had been strangers hours ago now shared something that would bind them together forever. The night was far from over, and there would be challenges ahead that none of them could anticipate, but for this moment they were safe, warm, and alive against all odds. Dawn came slowly to the desert, the storm finally exhausting itself as the first pale fingers of light crept across the horizon. Celeste woke to the sound of Storm's tiny whimpers and the gentle crackling of a fire that Mahpe had kept burning through the night. Her body ached in ways she'd never experienced, every muscle protesting the ordeal of birth. But she was alive, and more importantly, so was her son. Mahpe sat cross-legged near the cave entrance, silhouetted against the growing light, working on something with his hands. As her eyes adjusted, she could see he was carving what looked like a small wooden figure, his knife moving with precise, practiced strokes. The intensity of his concentration reminded her of Thomas bent over his machinery drawings, lost in the kind of focused work that made the rest of the world disappear. "You didn't sleep," she observed, her voice hoarse from the previous night's screaming. The simple act of speaking seemed to require more energy than she possessed, and she marveled at how thoroughly childbirth had depleted her reserves. Storm stirred against her chest, his tiny fist working its way free from the soft cloth wrapping, and she felt the fierce surge of protective love that was already becoming familiar. "Sleep is a luxury for another time," Mahpe replied, without looking up from his carving. "The storm may have passed, but there are other dangers in the desert that wake with the sun. I wanted to be sure we remained safe while you recovered your strength." His words carried an edge of tension that hadn't been there during the night, and she realized that delivering her baby had been only the first challenge they faced. As the light grew stronger, she could see the devastation the storm had left behind. Through the cave entrance, the landscape looked like a battlefield where nature had warred against itself. Uprooted sagebrush was scattered everywhere, and what had been dry washes yesterday were now raging torrents of brown water that would make travel impossible for days. The very air seemed different, charged with the ozone scent of lightning and the earthy smell of rain soaking into ground that rarely saw such moisture. "The wagon train," she said suddenly, the reality of her situation hitting her with new force. "They'll be looking for me, won't they? Once the storm cleared, they would have realized I was missing and come back to search." Even as she spoke the words, she knew they weren't true. The Hartwells had 26 other families to worry about, and stopping to search for one woman could endanger everyone. The mathematics of survival were harsh but clear. Mahpe's hands stilled on his carving, and she could see him choosing his words carefully. "I rode out before dawn to look for signs of your people," he said finally. "The storm washed away most tracks, but what I could find suggests they continued west during the night, probably believing you were already dead. Wagon masters do not stop for ghosts." His bluntness stung, but she appreciated his honesty more than false comfort would have provided. The implications of this revelation settled over her like a heavy blanket. She was alone in the Arizona territory with a newborn baby, no supplies beyond what Mahpe could provide, and no clear way to reach civilization. The nearest settlement was Fort Verde, almost 100 miles north, and that was assuming she could even travel in her current condition. The scope of her predicament was almost too large to comprehend. "What about your people?" she asked, grasping for alternatives. "Could I travel with you to the reservation? I could work, earn my keep somehow until I figure out what to do next." The suggestion felt presumptuous, even as she made it, asking a man she'd known for less than 24 hours to take responsibility for her survival. But desperation made normal social constraints seem irrelevant. Mahpe set down his carving and looked at her directly for the first time that morning, his dark eyes unreadable. "San Carlos is no place for a white woman with a child," he said quietly. "The Indian agent there barely tolerates Apache children, and white children would be seen as a threat to order. Besides, There are those among my people who would view helping you as betrayal, evidence that I have forgotten where my loyalties should lie. The complexity of his situation was something she hadn't fully considered, and she felt a stab of guilt for asking him to risk more than he already had. Storm chose that moment to wake fully, his tiny cry piercing the morning air with surprising volume for someone so small. Celeste instinctively moved to comfort him, marveling at how natural the motion felt despite her complete inexperience. The baby's needs were immediate and uncomplicated in a way that offered relief from the overwhelming uncertainties facing them. "He's hungry," she said, stating the obvious as she adjusted her dress to feed him. The intimacy of nursing in front of Mepi should have embarrassed her, but the events of the previous night had stripped away such conventional modesty. He had seen her at her most vulnerable and responded with nothing but compassion and competence. "There is a trading post 3 days south of here," Mepi said, tactfully focusing on his carving while she tended to Storm. "Run by a Mexican named Vasquez, who asks few questions and deals fairly with anyone who has something to trade. If you could reach him, he might help you get to Tucson or even California." The suggestion offered hope, but she could hear the uncertainty in his voice, the unspoken acknowledgement of how difficult such a journey would be. 3 days south, she repeated, trying to imagine covering that distance with a newborn baby and no transportation. "On foot, I assume, since my wagon is probably scattered across 10 square miles of desert. The logistics seemed impossible, but she had learned over the past year that impossible things sometimes happened anyway. Her entire journey west had been a series of seemingly insurmountable challenges that she'd somehow survived. Mepi held up the object he'd been carving, and she could see it was a small horse, perfectly detailed despite its tiny size. The craftsmanship was extraordinary, each line flowing naturally into the next, creating the impression of movement even in the static wood. "For Storm," he said simply, "every child should have something to play with, something to remind them that the world contains beauty as well as hardship." Dirty, the gesture touched her more deeply than grand declarations might have. "You have children of your own," she said, not really a question, but an observation based on his obvious comfort with babies and the tenderness with which he'd carved. "The toy. Back at the reservation." The words seemed to cause him pain, his jaw tightening almost imperceptibly before he regained his composure. "I had a son once," he said, his voice carefully controlled. He would have been about 5 years old now if he had lived to see his 3rd winter. His name was Nalnish, which means he who runs like wind. He died of the white man's sickness during our first winter at San Carlos, along with many other children whose bodies could not adapt to the reservation life. The revelation hung between them like smoke, heavy with grief that no words could adequately address. Celeste felt tears sting her eyes, both for Mepi's loss and for the terrible randomness of survival that had taken his child while preserving hers. "I'm sorry," she whispered, knowing the words were inadequate but needing to offer something. No parent should have to endure that. Storm had fallen asleep again in her arms, blissfully unaware of the conversation happening around him. "His mother blamed me," Mepi continued, as if her response had opened a dam that had been holding back years of accumulated pain. "She said I should have fought harder against the soldiers, should have kept us free in the mountains instead of agreeing to go to the reservation. She was not wrong. I chose survival over freedom, and our son paid the price." The self-recrimination in his voice was terrible to hear, the sound of a man who had been carrying guilt like stones in his chest. "You couldn't have known," Celeste said, though she knew the words wouldn't ease his burden. "You made the best decision you could with the information you had. Parents do that every day, and sometimes children die anyway. It doesn't mean you failed him." Her own words surprised her with their conviction, as if becoming a mother had instantly given her insights into the impossible choices parents faced. "Perhaps," Marpe said, though his tone suggested he hadn't forgiven himself. "My wife could not bear to look at me after we buried him. She took our daughter and went to live with her sister's family. I have not spoken to either of them in over a year." The isolation he'd chosen, or had forced upon him, explained much about his presence in this remote cave, his comfort with solitude that spoke of long practice. The morning sun was climbing, higher now, casting long shadows across the desert floor and warming the air enough to make their shelter feel less essential. But Celeste could see that travel today was still impossible, not just because of her condition, but because the flash floods had turned every low spot into a dangerous torrent. They would need at least another day, maybe two, before attempting to leave this sanctuary. "Tell me about the trading post," she said, needing to focus on practical matters rather than the weight of their shared losses. "This Vasquez, what kind of man is he? Can he be trusted with a woman and child?" If she was going to place her life and Storm's in another stranger's hands, she needed to know as much as possible about what she might be walking into. Mape seemed relieved to turn to more concrete topics. Emilio Vasquez came to this territory 20 years ago, when it was still dangerous for anyone but Apache and Mexican cowboys. He married a Tohono O'odham woman named Maria, and they built their trading post at the crossroads of several Indian trails. He speaks Spanish, English, Apache, and Tohono O'odham, and he has never cheated anyone in a deal, which is why people travel long distances to trade with him. The endorsement sounded genuine, based on personal experience rather than rumor. "What would I trade?" Celeste asked, looking down at her torn dress and mud-stained shoes. "Everything I owned was in that wagon, and the storm scattered most of it to the four winds. I have nothing of value except—" She stopped, remembering the small leather pouch Thomas had insisted she sew into her dress before they left St. Louis. Inside were $27, their emergency fund that was supposed to last until they found work in California. "Coin will be welcomed," Marpe assured her. "But Vasquez trades in many things: work, information, favors for the future. He once told me that every person who comes to his post has something valuable to offer, even if they don't recognize it themselves." The philosophy suggested a man who understood survival in its broadest sense, someone who recognized that cooperation and mutual aid were more valuable than gold in harsh country. Storm began to fuss again, and Celeste adjusted her position to comfort him, marveling at how quickly she was learning to interpret his different sounds. Already she could distinguish between his hungry cry and his uncomfortable cry, between sleepy whimpers and demands for attention. The speed with which these maternal instincts had developed was both reassuring and overwhelming. "He looks like his father," Marpe observed, though she wasn't sure how he could tell given Storm's wrinkled newborn features. "There is strength in his face, determination. He will be a fighter like his mother." The prediction felt like prophecy coming from a man who had demonstrated such insight into human character. "Thomas would have loved him," Celeste said, feeling the familiar hook of loss that had become her constant companion. He used to talk about teaching his son to read, to work with his hands, to be the kind of man who could build something lasting in a new country. Now that responsibility falls entirely to me. The weight of single parenthood was still settling. On her shoulders, heavier with each passing hour, a child raised by a strong woman learns different lessons than one raised by a man, Marpe said thoughtfully. "Not better or worse, but different. Storm will know what it means to survive against impossible odds, to endure hardship without breaking, to find strength in places others never look. These are valuable gifts." His perspective offered a way of viewing her situation that emphasized capability rather than limitation. As the morning progressed, Mahpe began making preparations for their eventual departure. He had supplies, cached in various parts of the cave, evidence of long-term occupancy that suggested this had been his retreat for months or even years. Water containers, dried food, ammunition for an old army rifle, medical supplies that would be invaluable for someone recovering from childbirth. He'd obviously planned for extended stays in this sanctuary. "How long have you been coming?" "Here," she asked, curious about the history of this place that had saved her life. The cave felt lived in, comfortable in ways that spoke of someone who'd spent significant time making it home. Though temporary, the painted symbols on the walls were weathered enough to suggest they were old, possibly predating Mahpe's occupation. "My grandfather used this cave when I was a boy," he explained, checking the contents of a leather bag that seemed to contain herbal medicines. "He was a shaman, a holy man who needed solitude to speak with the spirits. After he died, other men of her tribe would come here for vision quests, times of fasting and prayer, to seek guidance from the ancestors. I first came here 5 years ago, after we were forced onto the reservation." The spiritual significance of the place added another layer to her understanding of why he'd been here when she needed him most. "And the storm didn't worry you?" she asked, thinking of how terrified she'd been by the weather's violence. Being alone up here with lightning striking all around and floods rushing through every drawer. The question seemed to amuse him, though his smile was barely visible. "Storms are dangerous only if you fear them," he said with the confidence of someone who'd weathered many tempests. "This cave has protected people for generations, and the spirits of my grandfather and his father still watch over it. I knew I was safe here, and when you arrived, I knew you were meant to be safe here too." His faith in spiritual protection was absolute, unshaken by rational arguments about coincidence or luck. The day passed slowly, marked by Storm's feeding schedule and the gradual return of strength to Celeste's exhausted body. Mahpe proved to be excellent company, sharing stories of his childhood and his grandfather's teachings, while helping her understand the practical challenges they would face in reaching the trading post. His knowledge of desert survival was encyclopedic, covering everything from finding water to avoiding dangerous animals to reading weather signs that could mean the difference between life and death. As evening approached, bringing with it the prospect of spending another night in the cave, Celeste found herself dreading the moment when they would have to leave this sanctuary. Here, with Mahpe's protection and the security of shelter, she could almost forget the impossibility of her situation. But tomorrow, or the next day, she would have to venture back into a world that had no place for pregnant widows, armed only with hope and the kindness of strangers. "Are you afraid?" Mahpe asked as he built up the fire for the night, apparently reading her mood with the same insight he'd shown throughout their acquaintance. "Of leaving here, of facing what comes next." The question was gentle but direct, inviting honesty rather than false bravado. "Terrified," she admitted, surprised by her own candor. "Yesterday, I thought my biggest worry was whether the wagon train would reach California before the snow fell. Now I'm responsible for keeping Storm alive in country that wants to kill us both, and I have no idea what I'm doing." The confession felt both frightening and liberating, acknowledging fears she'd been trying to suppress. "Fear is wisdom in dangerous country," Mahpe said, settling beside the fire with the rifle across his knees. "Only fools and dead men feel no fear in the desert. But fear can also paralyze, can make people freeze when they need to act. The trick is to let fear make you careful without making you helpless." His advice carried the weight of hard-earned experience, lessons learned through survival rather than books. Outside, the desert night was settling over their sanctuary, with sounds that were both comforting and ominous. Coyotes called in the distance, their voices rising and falling like primitive music, while somewhere closer, an owl hooted its hunting song. The night was alive with creatures that thrived in darkness, predators and prey locked in the eternal dance of survival that governed all life in the wilderness. "Tomorrow we will plan our route to Vasquez," Mape said, banking the fire for the night. "And tonight we rest and let the desert speak to us. Sometimes the best decisions come not from thinking too hard, but from listening to what the land itself tells us." His words carried the rhythm of prayer, suggesting a man who found guidance in sources most people never considered. Celeste settled back against the firs, with Storm sleeping peacefully in her arms, feeling safer than she had any right to feel given their circumstances. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and difficult decisions, but tonight she was warm, fed, and protected by a man who seemed to understand something essential about survival that went beyond mere technique. Something that had to do with accepting what could not be changed while working to influence what could be. The third morning brought decision time. Celeste woke to find Mape already preparing travel supplies, his movements efficient and purposeful as he sorted items into 2 leather pouches. The sight filled her with equal parts relief and terror. Relief that their isolation would finally end. Terror at facing the vast desert with a 3-day-old baby and no guarantee of survival. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us now. Back to the story. The floods have receded enough for safe passage. Through the lower valleys, Mape announced without preamble, holding up a hand-drawn map sketched on what looked like scraped hide. "But we must leave this morning if we want to reach the first water source before the heat becomes dangerous for the baby." His tone brooked no argument, and she realized he'd been planning this journey while she slept, calculating distances and dangers with the precision of someone whose life had often depended on such calculations. Storm had developed a feeding schedule that seemed to occur every 2 hours without fail, and Celeste marveled at how completely her life had reorganized around his tiny but demanding needs. The baby showed no awareness of their precarious situation, concerned only with warmth, food, and the comfort of being held close to her heartbeat. His innocence felt both precious and terrifying, given what lay ahead. "How will we carry everything?" she asked, looking at the supplies Mape had assembled. Water containers, food for several days, blankets, medical supplies, and the rifle. With its ammunition, the pile seemed impossible for 2 people to transport, especially when one of them was still recovering from childbirth and carrying a baby. "I have horses," Mape said simply, as if this weren't the most important piece of information he could have shared. "Hidden in a canyon half a mile from here. 2 horses, both trained for desert travel and accustomed to carrying Apache warriors on long journeys. They will serve us well." His casual revelation of this crucial resource made her wonder what other advantages he'd been keeping in reserve. The prospect of riding horseback so soon after giving birth made every muscle in her body protest in advance, but she recognized it as their only viable option. Walking to the trading post would take a week or more, time they couldn't afford given their limited supplies and Storm's vulnerability. "I haven't ridden much," she admitted, remembering the few occasions when Thomas had managed to rent a gentle mare for afternoon rides in the countryside around St. Louis. "Apache women ride within days of giving birth when necessary," Mape assured her, though his expression suggested he understood the difficulty she faced. "We will travel slowly, rest frequently, and stop entirely if the journey becomes too hard for you to bear. But staying here is no longer safe." Something in his tone suggested new dangers she hadn't considered, and she felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air. "What aren't you telling me?" she pressed, recognizing the careful way he was avoiding her eyes. During their 3 days together, she'd learned to read his subtle expressions, to understand the unspoken communications that revealed as much as his words. "What's changed since yesterday?" Her question hung in the air between them, weighted with the trust they'd built and her growing fear that their sanctuary was about to become a trap. Mape set down the map and looked at her directly, his dark eyes serious. "Yesterday evening, while you slept, I saw smoke signals from the east, Apache signals, but not from my band. The message was simple. Soldiers are in the area searching for escaped Indians who left the reservation without permission." The revelation hit her like a physical blow, adding a new dimension of danger to their already desperate situation. "They're looking for you," she said, understanding flooding through her with terrible clarity. "That's why you were alone up here, isn't it? You didn't just come here for solitude and spiritual guidance. You left the reservation without permission, and now they're hunting you." The pieces fell into place with sickening logic explaining. His knowledge of safe routes and hidden resources. "The reservation is a prison, disguised as charity," Mape said, his voice carrying years of suppressed anger. "Men are not meant to live in cages, begging for food from those who took their freedom. I needed to remember what it felt like to hunt my own game, to sleep under stars I chose, to follow trails my grandfather walked. But the Indian agent counts us like cattle every week, and my absence has been noted." His admission transformed their situation from difficult to potentially deadly. "So helping me makes you a target," Celeste realized, guilt washing over her as she understood the full extent of his sacrifice. "By staying here with me, by planning to escort me to the trading post, you're making yourself more vulnerable to capture. They'll assume you've gone rogue, maybe even turned hostile." The implications multiplied in her mind, each more frightening than the last. "I made my choice 3 nights ago when I dreamed of a woman who needed help," Mahapi said firmly. "That choice led me to this place at the moment you needed someone most. I will not abandon you now because the path has become more dangerous." His loyalty was absolute and completely unearned, making her feel both grateful and unworthy of such dedication. The urgency of departure became clear as Mape explained the tactical situation. The soldiers would be following a predictable search pattern, checking known Apache camping spots and water sources. Their best chance of avoiding capture was to travel quickly along routes the military wouldn't expect, using game trails and hidden passages that required intimate knowledge of the terrain. It was a deadly game of hide-and-seek played across hundreds of square miles of unforgiving desert. "What happens if they catch us?" Celeste asked, though she dreaded the answer. "I mean, what would they do to you? To me and Storm?" The question revealed the depth of her ignorance about military justice and the treatment of Apache people who defied reservation boundaries. "They would take me back to San Carlos in chains," Mape said matter-of-factly. "Possibly to stand trial for desertion, depending on how vindictive the Indian agent feels. You would be questioned about your relationship with me, and Storm would be taken to an orphanage if they decided you were an unfit mother." The casual way he described these horrors made them even more chilling. "Unfit mother?" she repeated, her voice rising with indignation. "On what grounds?" But even as she asked the question, she knew the answer. A white woman who consorted with Apache renegades, who gave birth in the wilderness and accepted help from escaped Indians, would be viewed as morally compromised at best, mentally unstable at worst. "The army has its own ideas about proper behavior for white women," Mape explained, beginning to pack supplies with renewed urgency. "A woman who travels alone, who accepts help from Apache warriors, who cannot explain how she survived in the desert. Such a woman raises questions that make officials uncomfortable. They prefer simple stories with clear heroes and villains." His understanding of white prejudice was depressingly comprehensive. The horses, when they reached them, proved to be magnificent animals perfectly adapted to desert conditions. Both were pintos, their coats marked with patterns that would blend naturally with the landscape of shadow and sunlight. Mape's mount was a stallion with intelligent eyes and the muscular build of a horse bred for endurance rather than speed. The mare designated for Celeste was smaller but equally alert, with a gentle manner that suggested experience carrying precious cargo. "Her name is Ayana," Mape said, stroking the mare's neck with obvious affection. "It means eternal blossom. In the language of my grandmother's people, she belonged to my sister, who rode her during the long journey to the reservation. Ayana has carried pregnant women before, and she understands the need for gentle steps and careful footing." The horse seemed to sense the importance of her new responsibility, standing perfectly still while Celeste approached with Storm in her arms. Mounting the horse while holding a baby and still recovering from childbirth proved to be an exercise in controlled agony. Every movement sent sharp pains through muscles that were still healing, and she had to bite her lip to keep from crying out. But Mape had rigged a kind of sling that allowed her to secure Storm against her chest, while keeping both hands free. For the reins, and gradually she found a position that was bearable, if not comfortable. "We ride south toward the Salt River, then west through the Superstition Mountains," Mape explained, pointing out landmarks on his hide map. "The route is longer than the direct path, but it follows water sources and provides cover from observation. If we maintain a steady pace and avoid delays, we should reach Vasquez's trading post by tomorrow evening." The timeline seemed optimistic given her physical condition, but she nodded agreement, unwilling to voice doubts that might delay their departure. The first hours of riding were a revelation in endurance. Every step the mare took sent vibrations through Celeste's still tender body, and she had to concentrate on breathing deeply to manage the discomfort. Storm seemed to enjoy the motion, settling into a peaceful sleep against her chest that suggested the rhythm reminded him of her heartbeat during pregnancy. The desert landscape unfolded around them with a harsh beauty that took her breath away when pain allowed her to notice. Mape proved to be an ideal traveling companion, reading the terrain with supernatural skill while monitoring her condition with subtle but constant attention. When she began to sway in the saddle from exhaustion, he called for rest breaks without making her admit weakness. When Storm woke hungry, he found shaded spots with water nearby, creating perfect nursing stations as if by magic. His knowledge of every canyon, every hidden spring, every game trail seemed encyclopedic. "How do you know this country so well?" she asked during one of their rest stops, watching him study tracks in the sand with the concentration of a scholar reading ancient texts. "Did you grow up here?" The question seemed to transport him back through years of memory, and his expression grew distant with remembering. "My grandfather brought me to these mountains when I was 7 years old," he said, kneeling to examine what looked like deer tracks to her untrained eye. He said a man who knows only the reservation knows nothing, that the land itself holds wisdom that cannot be taught in schools or learned from books. "We spent entire summers following game trails, learning to read weather signs, understanding how water moves through rock." His education had been conducted in the most demanding classroom imaginable. "What happened to him?" Celeste asked, settling into a comfortable position against a boulder while Storm nursed. "Your grandfather." She was beginning to understand that every older generation of Apache had faced loss and displacement on a scale that dwarfed her own troubles. "He died in his sleep during our second winter at San Carlos," Mape replied, his voice carrying the weight of unfinished grief. "The doctor said his heart simply stopped, but I think he died of homesickness. He was a man of the mountains, and the desert at San Carlos reminded him every day of everything he had lost." The casual mention of heartbreak as a cause of death revealed how completely the Apache had been severed from their traditional life. As afternoon shadows began to lengthen, they encountered their first real danger. Mape suddenly raised his hand for silence, then dismounted and moved forward on foot to study something ahead. When he returned, His expression was grim with concern that made Celeste's heart race with anticipation of bad news. "Cavalry patrol," he said quietly, helping her dismount in the shelter of a large rock formation. 6 soldiers, maybe 8, following the main trail about a mile ahead of us. They are moving slowly, searching for signs of passage. The news confirmed her worst fears, while simultaneously proving the wisdom of Mapi's route selection. They were being hunted by professional trackers with official authority. "Sidi Kandi. We go around them?" she asked, trying to keep panic out of her voice for Storm's sake. The baby seemed to sense tension even when she thought she was hiding it, becoming fussier and harder to comfort when she felt afraid. "Find another route to the trading post." The question revealed how completely dependent she'd become on Mapi's expertise, how thoroughly her survival had come to depend on his knowledge and judgment. "There is a canyon path that will add 6 hours to our journey," Mapi said, studying his mental map of the terrain with the intensity of a general. "Planning battle strategy. Steep and dangerous for horses, but passable if we are careful. The soldiers will not expect anyone to use such a difficult route, especially not a woman with a newborn child." His assessment balanced risk against necessity with mathematical precision. The detour through the canyon proved to be the most harrowing part of their journey so far. The trail, if it could be called that, was barely wide enough for single-file passage, with steep drops on one side and loose rock faces on the other. Ayana picked her way forward with the careful precision of a dancer, seeming to understand that one wrong step could mean disaster for all of them. Celeste found herself praying to whatever gods might be listening, bargaining with the universe for safe passage. "Don't look down," Mapi advised from ahead, though his calm tone suggested this wasn't his first time navigating such treacherous terrain. "Trust your horse and keep your eyes on the path directly ahead. Ayana has made this journey before, and she will not fail you." His confidence in the mare was absolute, and Celeste tried to share his faith while every instinct screamed warnings about the precipitous drops just inches away. Halfway through the canyon, Storm woke hungry and began to cry with the piercing urgency that only babies could achieve. The sound echoed off the rock walls, magnified and distorted until it seemed to fill the entire space with demands for attention. Celeste felt panic rising in her chest as she realized there was nowhere to stop, no way to comfort him without dismounting on a ledge barely wide enough for walking. "Sing to him," Mape suggested, his voice carrying back to her with perfect calm despite their precarious situation. "Apache mothers sing to their babies during difficult journeys. The sound of your voice will comfort him more than food, and the echoes will help hide the direction of the sound from anyone who might be listening." His practical wisdom transformed her panic into purposeful action. She began with a lullaby her own mother had sung, an Irish melody that spoke of green hills and gentle rain, then found herself improvising verses about desert storms and brave horses, about finding safety in the most unlikely places. Storm's cries gradually subsided as her voice found the rhythm that soothed him, and she realized she was discovering something fundamental about motherhood, about the power of presence and voice to create comfort even in chaos. By the time they emerged from the canyon into the broader valley beyond, the sun was setting with the spectacular intensity that only desert skies could produce. The western horizon blazed with colors that had no names, painting the landscape in shades of gold and crimson that made even their exhausted condition seem like a small price to pay for witnessing such beauty. "We camp here tonight," Mapi announced, indicating a sheltered spot near a small spring that seemed to appear from nowhere in the rocky terrain. "The trading post is only 4 hours ahead, but traveling after dark in this country is dangerous for horses and riders alike. Better to arrive safely tomorrow than to risk injury in the darkness." his decision-making balanced caution with progress in ways that demonstrated years of experience in hostile territory. As they made camp, Celeste found herself marveling at how completely her life had changed in less than a week. 7 days ago, she'd been a pregnant widow traveling with a wagon train, worried about weather and supply shortages. Now she was a mother traveling through Apache country with an escaped reservation Indian, fleeing cavalry patrols and depending entirely on skills she'd never imagined needing. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked Mape as they shared a simple meal beside their small fire. "Helping me, I mean. Your life would be much simpler if you'd stayed hidden in your cave and let me figure things out on my own." The question had been building in her mind all day, guilt warring with gratitude as she understood the full cost of his assistance. "Regret is a luxury for those who have time to waste," Mape replied, checking the rifle that never left his side. "Every choice eliminates other possibilities, but dwelling on what might have been prevents us from dealing with what is. You needed help. I was able to provide it, and together we have brought new life safely through its first days in a dangerous world. That seems like cause for satisfaction rather than regret." His philosophy was pragmatic but not cold, accepting responsibility without self-pity. "What will you do after we reach the trading post?" Celeste asked, realizing she'd been so focused on her own survival that she'd given little thought to his future. "You can't go back to the reservation, not with the army looking for you, and traveling alone will be dangerous if they're still searching." Her concern for his welfare surprised her with its intensity, evidence of how much he'd come to mean to her beyond mere survival assistance. "There are places in Mexico where Apache people can live freely," he said, staring into the fire with the expression of someone contemplating difficult choices. "Communities of people who chose exile over surrender, who would welcome someone with my skills and knowledge. It would mean leaving everything familiar, starting over completely in a foreign country, but it would also mean freedom, to live as a man rather than as a numbered prisoner." The prospect of permanent exile was clearly painful, but preferable to captivity. "That sounds lonely," Celeste observed, thinking of her own experience with starting over in unfamiliar places, leaving behind everyone you know, everyone who shares your history and traditions. Her sympathy was based on recognition rather than pity, the understanding of someone who'd made similar sacrifices for the possibility of a better future. "All choices require sacrifice," Mape said philosophically. "The question is whether we sacrifice our freedom for security or our security for freedom. I have tried living in a cage, and I found it was no life at all." His words carried conviction born from hard experience, the certainty of someone who'd tested the alternatives and found them wanting. As the night settled around their small camp, bringing with it the sounds and smells of the desert after sunset, Celeste found herself facing the reality that their time together was almost over. Tomorrow they would reach the trading post, and she would have to trust yet another stranger with her survival while Mape rode south toward an uncertain future in Mexico. The prospect filled her with a loneliness that went beyond mere practical concerns. "I don't know how to thank you," she said finally, the words inadequate for everything he'd done, but the only ones she could find. "You saved my life, delivered my baby, kept us both alive through the worst experience I've ever faced. How does someone repay a debt like that?" The impossibility of adequate compensation made her gratitude feel hollow, insufficient for the magnitude of his sacrifice. "Your survival is thanks enough," Mape replied, settling back against his saddle with the rifle across his knees. "Your son will grow up strong and capable because his mother refused to surrender when surrender seemed like the only option. He will carry that lesson his entire life, and perhaps one day he will use it to help someone else who needs rescue. From impossible circumstances, His perspective transformed her ordeal into something larger than personal survival, a legacy of strength that could outlast their current troubles. The trading post materialized from the morning heat like a mirage made solid, its adobe walls and tin roof shimmering in the distance as they crested the final ridge before descent into the valley. Celeste felt her heart clench with emotions she couldn't untangle, relief at reaching safety, warring with dread at the prospect of saying goodbye to the man who had become her anchor in chaos. Vasquez's establishment sprawled across a natural crossroads where three ancient trails converged, its buildings arranged around a central courtyard that buzzed with activity even at the early hour. Mexican vaqueros watered their horses at stone troughs, while Tohono O'odham women displayed baskets and pottery under ramada shelters. The scene represented everything the isolated reservation life denied, a living marketplace where different cultures met and mingled freely. Remember, you are a widow traveling alone who was separated from her wagon train, Marpe instructed as they approached the outer buildings. Your baby was born during the storm, delivered by a Mexican midwife, who has since continued south. You know nothing of Apache warriors or cavalry patrols. His coaching felt like preparation for a performance that could mean the difference between safety and disaster. Emilio Vasquez himself emerged from the main building before they'd finished dismounting, a stocky man in his 50s whose weathered face spoke of decades under the desert sun. His eyes took in their travel-stained condition and the baby in Celeste's arms with the quick assessment of someone accustomed to reading desperate stories in the appearance of unexpected visitors. "Senora," he said in accented but fluent English, his manner respectful but cautious. "You appear to have traveled far under difficult circumstances. I am Emilio Vasquez, and this is my establishment. How may I be of assistance?" His formality masked careful evaluation, the wariness of a man who survived by knowing when to help and when to remain neutral. "My name is Celeste Monroe," she replied, following Marpe's script while trying to project confidence she didn't feel. "I was traveling with the Hartwell wagon train when the storm separated us. I've been walking for days, following game trails, hoping to find help." The lie came easier than she'd expected, perhaps because it contained enough truth to feel believable. Vasquez's wife Maria appeared in the doorway, a small woman whose Tohono O'odham heritage was evident in her features and the intricate silver jewelry that caught the morning light. Her eyes immediately focused on Storm with the instinctive concern of a mother who had raised children in harsh country. And Celeste saw her expression soften with genuine sympathy. "Dios mío, you gave birth on the trail," Maria said, moving forward with the brisk efficiency of someone accustomed to managing crises. "Come, bring the baby inside where it is cool. You need food, rest, and someone to check that you are healing properly." Her take-charge attitude was exactly what Celeste needed, someone who would act first and ask questions later. Marpe remained mounted, his posture suggesting readiness for immediate departure despite their successful arrival. The sight of him preparing to leave sent unexpected panic through Celeste's chest, a visceral reaction to abandonment that surprised her with its intensity. Over 5 days, he had become more than her rescuer, more than her guide, something approaching. Family in ways she was only beginning to understand. "Wait," she said, turning back to him with Storm still in her arms. "I mean, surely you'll stay for a meal. Rest your horse." The words came out more desperately than she'd intended, revealing emotions she'd been trying to keep hidden even from herself. "You've traveled as far as I have." Vasquez's eyes sharpened as he studied Marpe more carefully, taking in details that marked him as Apache despite his attempt to remain inconspicuous. The trader's expression didn't change, but Celeste could see recognition dawning in his weathered features. This was a man who made his living by reading people and situations accurately. "You are welcome at my table, amigo." Vasquez said carefully, his tone neutral but not hostile. Any man who helps a woman in distress deserves hospitality, regardless of his other circumstances. The words carried layers of meaning, acknowledgement without judgment, the diplomatic language of someone who survived by remaining useful. To all parties, "I cannot stay," Mapi replied, though Celeste heard reluctance in his voice. "There are places I must be, people who expect me elsewhere." His refusal was polite but firm, the decision of someone who understood that lingering meant danger for everyone involved. "The lady will be safe here, and that was my only concern," Maria stepped forward then, surprising everyone by addressing Mape directly in Apache. The conversation that followed was brief but intense, conducted in tones too low for Celeste to follow, even if she'd understood the language. When it ended, Maria's expression had changed subtly, showing new respect mixed with what looked like maternal concern. "She says you are Mahpe, grandson of the shaman Nalnish," Maria explained to her husband in English, apparently deciding that full disclosure served everyone's interests better than continued deception. "She knew your grandfather when she was young, before the troubles began. She says you have done a sacred thing, helping to bring new life safely into the world." The revelation transformed the dynamic of their entire interaction. Vasquez nodded slowly, his business instincts warring with what Celeste suspected were deeper loyalties and older obligations. "The Apache are always welcome here when they come in peace," he said finally, looking directly at Mapi. "But these are dangerous times, and cavalry patrols ask many questions. Perhaps it would be safer for everyone if your visit were brief." The warning was gentle but clear, protection offered within careful limits. "You understand," Mapi said to Celeste, his dark eyes holding hers with an intensity that made her chest tight. "I have brought you to safety, but I cannot stay to see you settled. That would put you and these good people at risk." His explanation was logical and necessary, but it felt like abandonment nonetheless, the severing of a connection that had kept her alive through the worst days of her life. "I understand," she replied, though the words came out shakier than she'd intended. "But I need you to know what you did for me. For Storm, it saved our lives in ways that go beyond just the physical rescue. You gave me strength I didn't know I had." Her gratitude felt inadequate, too small for the magnitude of what he'd given her. "You had that strength already," Mape said, his voice gentle but firm. "I simply provided circumstances where you could discover it. Storm will grow up knowing his mother is a survivor, someone who refused to surrender when surrender seemed like the only choice. That knowledge will serve him well in whatever challenges he faces." His perspective reframed her ordeal as triumph rather than mere survival. From inside the trading post came the sound of men's voices speaking English with military precision, and Vasquez's expression grew suddenly tense. He moved casually toward the main building, but Celeste could see the alertness in his posture, the readiness of someone preparing to manage a potentially explosive situation. "Soldiers," Mahpe said quietly, reading the signs with the same skill he'd shown throughout their journey. "Probably asking about Apache movement in the area, checking whether anyone has seen escaped reservation Indians." His assessment was calm, but carried undertones of urgency that made Celeste's heart race with renewed fear. "Go," she said, understanding finally dawning that their goodbye would have to be immediate and final. "Before they see you, before anyone gets hurt." The words were practical, but felt like tearing out a piece of her heart, ending the most important relationship of her adult life with the efficiency of a business transaction. Mapi reached into his leather pouch and withdrew something small, wrapped in soft deerskin. "For Storm when he is older," he said, pressing the package into her hands. "To help him remember that he was born during a great storm and survived because his mother was braver than the thunder." The gift felt warm in her palm, significant beyond its physical weight. "What is it?" she asked, but he was already turning his horse away from the trading post, away from safety, away from her. His departure felt sudden and final, like a door closing on a chapter of her life she wasn't ready to finish. "Something to help him understand who he is." Mahpe called back, his voice already growing distant as his horse moved toward the desert. Trails that would take him south toward Mexico and an uncertain future. And to remember that sometimes the greatest help comes from the most unexpected sources. She watched until he disappeared into the maze of canyons and rock formations that surrounded the valley, her chest tight with emotions she couldn't name. The man who had delivered her child, saved her life, and taught her things about survival and strength she'd never imagined was gone, vanished into the vastness of the territory like a spirit returning to the elements that had shaped him. "Senora," Vasquez called softly from the doorway, his tone urgent but respectful. "The soldiers will want to speak with you about your journey. It would be best if you were inside, tending to your baby. When they emerge..." His warning snapped her back to immediate reality, to the necessity of maintaining the fiction that would keep them all safe. She hurried inside, just as 3 cavalry officers emerged from Vasquez's office, their blue uniforms dusty from hard travel, and their expressions grim with the frustration of men whose mission was proving more difficult than expected. The senior officer, a captain with prematurely grey hair and lines of fatigue around his eyes, looked at her with the mixture of suspicion and protective instinct that white women seem to inspire in military men. "Ma'am," he said, touching his hat in a gesture of automatic courtesy. "Captain Morrison, 1st Cavalry. Mr. Vasquez tells me you were separated from your wagon train during the recent storm. That must have been a terrifying experience for a woman in your condition." His sympathy was genuine but overlaid with the professional interest of someone gathering intelligence. "It was," Celeste replied, holding Storm closer and allowing exhaustion to show in her voice. "I thought we were going to die out there, wandering in circles for days without food or proper shelter. If not for the kindness of a Mexican midwife I encountered, I don't know what would have happened." The lie came more easily now, reinforced by genuine emotion and the physical evidence of recent hardship. "This midwife," Captain Morrison pressed gently. "Did she say where she was headed?" "We're trying to account for all travelers in the area, make sure everyone reached safety after the storm." His questions felt like a trap, though his tone remained conversational and concerned. "South toward Hermosillo," Celeste said, remembering geography from the maps Thomas had studied obsessively during their planning. She said she had family there, a daughter who was expecting her first child. The fabrication felt dangerous but necessary, another layer of protection for Mape's escape route. The captain made notes in a small leather journal, his attention to detail suggesting this interview was more than casual concern for her welfare. "Did you encounter anyone else during your journey? Other travelers, Indians, anyone who might have been in the area during the past week?" The question felt loaded with significance, and she understood that her answer could have consequences, extending far beyond her own situation. "No one," she said firmly, meeting his eyes with what she hoped was convincing directness. "Just empty desert and more empty desert. I began to think I was the only person left alive in the whole territory." Her response seemed to satisfy him, or at least failed to trigger whatever suspicions he'd brought to the interview. After the soldiers departed, heading north toward the reservation, with the tired resignation of men whose quarry had slipped through their fingers once again, Celeste found herself truly alone for the first time in days. Maria busied herself preparing a room where she could rest properly, and Vasquez returned to his ledgers. But the absence of Mahpe's steady presence left her feeling hollow in ways she hadn't anticipated. That evening, after Storm had been fed, and was sleeping peacefully in a proper cradle Maria had produced from storage, Celeste finally unwrapped the gift Mape had left for her son. Inside, the deerskin was a small carved figure, a horse and rider so perfectly detailed she could make out individual features despite the tiny scale. The craftsmanship was extraordinary, but what made her gasp was the realization that the rider was clearly a woman holding a baby, and the woman's hair had been stained with the same reddish-brown color as her own. Wrapped around the base of the carving was a strip of paper with words written in careful English script. For Storm Monroe, born in the greatest tempest the desert had seen in 50 years, delivered safely by his mother's courage and protected by the spirits who watch over brave travelers. May he grow strong like the horse, wise like the rider, and free like the wind that carries eagles. The message was signed simply with an Apache symbol she didn't recognize but somehow understood represented sky. She held the carving too, the lamplight, marveling at the detail and the care that had gone into creating something so beautiful for a child who might never fully understand its significance. But perhaps that didn't matter. Perhaps what mattered was that somewhere in Mexico, a man who had sacrificed his own safety for strangers would remember a stormy night when he'd helped bring new life into a world that often seemed determined to destroy it. Outside her window, the desert night settled over the trading post with sounds that were becoming familiar, coyotes calling in the distance and the whisper of wind through sage and stone. Tomorrow would bring new decisions about her future, practical concerns about reaching California and building a life for herself and Storm. But tonight, she was safe, her son was healthy, and somewhere in the vastness of the territory, a man whose name meant sky was riding toward freedom under stars that connected all travelers, no matter how far apart their paths might lead them. 3 years later, Celeste stood in the doorway of her small house in Tucson, watching Storm take his first unsteady steps across the wooden floor she'd scrubbed smooth with her own hands. The boy moved with the determined focus that had marked him from birth, pursuing his destination with single-minded intensity that reminded her daily of the circumstances surrounding his arrival in the world. The house wasn't much, just 3 rooms and a kitchen, but it represented everything Thomas had dreamed about when he'd talked of building something permanent in the West. She'd purchased it with money earned from 2 years of seamstress work and careful saving, every stitch and every penny bringing her closer to the independence that had seemed impossible during those desperate days in the desert. "Mama," Storm said clearly, his vocabulary expanding daily as his world grew larger. He'd developed Thomas's curiosity about how things worked, combined with what she suspected was Mape's intuitive understanding of natural patterns. The combination created a child who noticed details other people missed, who found wonder in ordinary things that adults took for granted. Mrs. Catherine Henley knocked on the doorframe, her weekly visit to check on the widow Monroe and her remarkable boy, part of a routine that had developed since Celeste's arrival in Tucson. The older woman had appointed herself unofficial guardian of single mothers in the territory, a role that combined genuine concern with an appetite for interesting stories. "Good morning, Celeste," Catherine said, settling into her usual chair with the familiarity of extended friendship. "I see Storm is becoming quite the explorer. Before long, you won't be able to keep up with him." Her observation carried the knowing tone of someone who'd raised 5 children to adulthood in frontier conditions. "He's certainly determined," Celeste agreed, scooping Storm into her arms before he could investigate the hot stove that had become his latest fascination. "Sometimes I think he inherited every stubborn trait from both sides of his family." The comment was casual, but carried deeper meaning for anyone who knew the full story of his birth. Through the window came the sound of wagons and voices, the weekly supply train that connected Tucson to the outside world and brought news from places she'd once hoped to reach. California gold country seemed like a different dream now, belonging to a different woman who'd existed before she learned what it meant to survive on her own terms. "I received a letter from my cousin in San Francisco," Catherine announced, producing an envelope from her reticule with the theatrical flair she brought to all interesting developments. She mentions seeing a newspaper article about Apache prisoners being released from military custody, something about new policies regarding reservation boundaries. The news was delivered casually, but Catherine's sharp eyes watched for Celeste's reaction with obvious interest. "That's encouraging," Celeste replied carefully, having learned over the years to deflect Catherine's gentle probing into her past. Perhaps the government is finally learning that treating people humanely serves everyone's interests better than cruelty. Her response was diplomatic, but carried genuine hope for people she would probably never see again. Storm wiggled free from her arms and toddled toward his toy box, a wooden crate Thomas had made before his death that now held treasures accumulated during their settled life in Tucson. His favorite possession was the carved horse and rider Mapi had left for him, though he was still too young to understand its significance. He carried it everywhere, talking to it in the mixture of English and invented language that marked his current stage of development. "He certainly has an unusual relationship with that little carving," Catherine observed, watching Storm arrange his toys with the systematic precision that marked all his activities. "You said it was made by a Mexican craftsman you met during your journey." The slight emphasis on "said" suggested Catherine had never completely believed the official version of Storm's birth story. "Yes," Celeste confirmed, sticking to the narrative that had protected them all these years. "A very skilled artist who understood what children treasure." The half-truth came easily now, polished by repetition and necessity into something that served multiple purposes. A commotion outside drew their attention to the window, where a small crowd had gathered around what appeared to be a Mexican trader displaying goods from his pack train. Such visits were common enough, but something about this one felt different, charged with an energy that made Celeste's pulse quicken with recognition she couldn't quite name. "Looks like Senor Martinez has returned from his southern route," Catherine noted, recognizing the trader who made periodic visits to Tucson with goods from deeper in Mexico. "He always brings the most interesting items, things you can't find anywhere else in the territory." Her curiosity was evident as she gathered her shawl in preparation for investigating the new arrivals. Storm had noticed the excitement, too, pressing his face to the window with the intense concentration he brought to all new experiences. Something about the scene outside seemed to fascinate him beyond the usual childhood interest in novel events, and Celeste found herself studying his expression for clues to what had captured his attention. "Would you like to see what Senor Martinez has brought?" she asked, lifting Storm to get a better view. Through the window, she could see the trader arranging items on a colorful blanket, while townspeople examined his wares with the serious consideration of people whose shopping opportunities were limited by geography and circumstance. As they approached the trading area, Celeste noticed Martinez deep in conversation with a man whose back was turned to them. Something about the stranger's posture, the way he held himself with quiet alertness, sent a shock of recognition through her system that made her steps falter. It couldn't be, the rational part of her mind insisted, but her heart was already racing with possibilities she'd trained herself not to consider. The man turned as they approached, and time seemed to stop as she looked into dark eyes that had haunted her dreams for 3 years. Mipe stood before her, older and bearing new lines of experience around his eyes, but unmistakably the same man who had delivered her son and taught her what survival really meant. "Celeste," he said quietly, his voice carrying the same calm, strength she remembered from their desperate days in the desert. "I hoped I might find you here, you and the boy." His presence felt both miraculous and inevitable, as if the desert itself had conspired to bring them together again at precisely the right moment. Storm stared at the stranger with the intense focus he brought to everything that puzzled him, then suddenly broke into the brilliant smile he reserved for people who somehow passed tests no one else understood. Without hesitation, he reached toward Mahpe with the trust that had marked him from birth, recognizing something familiar in a face he'd never consciously seen before. "This is Storm," Celeste managed to say, her voice unsteady with emotions she'd thought safely buried. "Storm, this is the man who helped bring you into the world." The introduction felt simultaneously inadequate and perfect, acknowledging both the magnitude of what Mahpe had done and the simplicity of what mattered most. Mahpe accepted Storm into his arms with the gentle competence she remembered, and the boy settled against him as if this were the most natural thing in the world. "He has grown strong," Mahpe observed, his voice warm with satisfaction at seeing the successful outcome of their shared ordeal. "And his eyes hold intelligence that will serve him well in whatever path he chooses." "You're free," she said, hardly daring to believe it but seeing the evidence in his relaxed posture and public presence. "The military, the reservation, all of it." Her question hung unfinished between them, hope and disbelief warring in her chest. "New treaties, new policies," he confirmed, his expression showing the same cautious optimism she felt. "Apache people who can demonstrate ability to support themselves are being allowed to live as free citizens, no longer confined to reservation boundaries. It is not everything we hoped for, but it is a beginning." His explanation carried the weight of political changes she'd only heard rumors about. As the afternoon progressed and Storm napped peacefully in Mahpe's arms, they found themselves talking with the easy comfort of old friends, filling in the gaps of 3 years with stories of survival, growth, and the slow process of building new lives from the fragments of old dreams. The conversation felt both momentous and natural, weighted with significance, but flowing with the rhythm of people who had shared something too profound for ordinary social boundaries. "I have a proposition," Mahpe said finally, his tone suggesting something he'd been considering for some time. "I've purchased land near the Mexican border, good water and protection from the worst weather. It would be a place where Storm could grow up understanding both worlds, where you could build whatever kind of life you choose without having to explain your past to people who would not understand." His offer hung between them like a bridge, spanning the gulf between their separate existences. Celeste looked at her son, sleeping peacefully in the arms of the man who had saved them both, at the life she'd built through determination and careful compromise, at the future that suddenly seemed to contain possibilities she'd never dared imagine. Storm stirred in his sleep and smiled, as if his dreams included adventures yet to come, in places where storms were just weather, and courage was the only currency that mattered. "Yes," she said simply, the word carrying 3 years of unspoken gratitude and the promise of whatever came next. "Yes, we'll come home with you." And for the first time since Thomas died, the word home felt like something real, rather than just another destination on a map drawn by other people's dreams. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.